All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming to this one instead of the main event, which was the person who started this conference, I guess. So thanks for coming here instead of to Frank's. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk about the 12 facets of the OpenAPI standard. And I'll admit straight up front, I inherited this talk from my colleague, Dev Svarts. He broke his collarbone and had to stay in France. So I'm doing this on his behalf, but I'm going to give it a good shot. I'm Ann Gentle. I work as a developer experience manager at Cisco. That means I manage teams of developer advocates, API writers, and we are working hard to make Cisco APIs better across the board. You might not know, but Cisco does have a pretty decent sized API product portfolio. So security is a big part of our portfolio, collaboration, of course, networking devices, in case you hadn't heard of Cisco, on the internet, and a lot of data center as well. So a lot of, infrastructure as code, working to basically help people run things at scale, right? I'm here from Austin, Texas. Great to be in San Francisco again. Cisco's in San Jose, so usually I get to be on the other side, but it's really nice to be traveling again. This is great to be in person, so thanks for coming. If you have questions, feel free to reach out on Twitter or just come up after this session. I think that's been working out pretty well today. But let's start with the 12 facets. So facets are basically a way to, cut through maybe a gem, I guess is the best way to think of it, but cut through a geometric shape, and then it can bring in more light. So I kind of like this metaphor, and we're going to look through, the facets of OpenAPI. I hope you're all familiar with OpenAPI. This is a specifications conference, but I want to really talk about how do we use them in a lot of different angles, right? We're trying to illuminate more for developers, right? So we tend to describe, API contracts, and there's actually a talk today where someone is trying to build a tool around an API contract tool, right? But what we're saying is that an API should be able to say, I promise you that if you do these things, this will happen. If you give me this request, you'll get this response. And so that's what we're working with teams at Cisco to say, this is a contract between Cisco and the people using this API. So the consumer and the provider are an important part of this contract. And so formalizing the contract is what you do when you write your API specification. So this, I hate to assume that everyone knows what an OpenAPI specification looks like. This is one that we use to train people at Cisco. We've actually put together like a 4 half-day training on OpenAPI because it is something you have to learn and become familiar with. And I don't know if anyone else is familiar with the deck of cards API, but I love this for training purposes. It does not require authentication, so you don't have to worry about all of that. And I think you can even walk up to a 10-year-old on the street and they understand the data model for a deck of cards, 4 suits, kind of the king, queen, ace, jack. And it's just very helpful to start with that data model that people already understand and then talk about the actions you can do with a deck of cards, right? So if you just want to, have example documents to help people understand OAS, understand this kind of formalization, I really like this API to help people understand, I'm really just saying, when you do this, you'll get this action. And a deck of cards data model is a really nice way to teach that and go through the basics. Now, I also like to tell people, and we work with a lot of teams across Cisco. Like I said, we have, in one of my early slides, we are working with thousands of GitHub repositories for people to publish to developer.cisco.com. So while we don't have 1,000 OAS files, we are helping teams by onboarding them to developer.cisco.com so that they can publish on our site. One of our more popular APIs is Meraki. Meraki lets people manage network devices. They have smart cameras that can do like in-event security. One of the fascinating use cases is if there's a fight starting in a soccer stadium, these cameras can detect that and bring in people who can help manage that. So this is what they're doing with this API. That's only one of the use cases, right? But when a team brings us their OAS file, we tell them to go to something like editor.swagger.io. If it can be parsed in here, if it can be displayed in here, then we can use it on developer.cisco.com. The other thing I really like about editor.swagger.io is that it will give line-by-line error messages. So the next team that might bring me one that's like a 40,000 line OAS file, it'll go through and tell them which line the error is in. So saves me time up front. Kudos to the people working on Swagger Editor. Love that thing. Now, we also use it to publish reference documentation. And you know, this is our own take on reference documentation. We are taking the OAS file and then rendering it into, you know, one of the 3-panel, very classic like Stripe docs, documentation, sidebar table of contents. People can see exactly what git put post patch delete and what they are doing, right? The paths, the request body, the request parameters, what responses they're gonna get. We're trying to get all the teams to put in all of the status codes. And this is basically, of course, you've heard it probably at mini talks. This is one of the basic things, one of the basic facets, let's call it, of the OpenAPI standard. Now, in our case, we've been able to use it to try out operations. And I know this sounds pretty basic, but this has been really game-changing for a place like Cisco, which, you know, frankly, this for teams is really, really important. They want people to be able to try out the API. And in our case, we give them an API key. It has sort of mocked out data, and they can only write. So this is sort of a shared sandbox environment. But if they want to bring their own API keys, they can try these for themselves, and they can run anything they want. They can do read-write because it's their key. Another aspect is to display code, but not just display code. Of course, you can also generate code. One of the things that this Meraki team has done, though, that I do like that kind of goes above and beyond is they've written their SDK examples to go into the reference documentation. So this is getting beyond just, you know, writing out examples for the Python requests library. You know, that is very basic, simple, straightforward. Maybe it really helps out people to understand it, but I really like it that in the SDK examples, they can do a better, you know, more important, like best practices. Please don't put your API key directly in your examples. Point them to a better example, point them to a way to do this correctly, right? And then the other thing we're teaching a lot of teams about, and this is the thing I get questions, maintaining an OpenAPI standard, you have to talk about how to maintain it through a life cycle, right? Tons of tools in the ecosystem working on this. We're pretty simple with teams and in our training. And we tell them, look, get started somewhere. Usually it's going to be a product manager that is going to start with a simple draft. Hand-coded, handwritten most likely. The product manager knows what features they want the API to do. They're going to be able to do that sort of initial, like, this is what it is. Hands it over to the engineer, and the engineer is going to encode it, right? Do the actual, what are the payloads? What are the errors? This is where it becomes reality. And that can be then handed over to a technical writer. And wow, once we started training technical writers on OpenAPI, they are absolutely amazed at the power that is in their hands then to enrich it with better descriptions, just make it better examples embedded, like the SDK examples. This is where people really start getting excited about what we can do with OpenAPI on our developer portal. And then once it's all in the format that they want, they've got it all how they like it, then they can publish to developer.cisco.com, right? So some of our best practices are make sure you have a single source of truth, get it into a Git repo, and use pull request, use that normal coding lifecycle, have a workflow where you review each other's changes, right? And another thing that we talk to teams about is be clear who gets to merge those and, you know, which branch and all of that. Sometimes with some teams, it's the technical writers who are like, I own this, I will be the one who says what gets in and what merges. You know, sometimes the engineering team is more stern about it, and they're going to be the ones who are stricter. So, you know, just make sure the team is communicating about that. And then we are doing a lot of work to educate the team members. And like I said, once the tech writers get the hang of this, they are going to town. So that is really exciting. And then obviously every team is different. Every team is in a different maturity in this cycle, but they are refining and they are, getting better at doing these things and maintaining an API changelog. And I'll talk a little bit later about some of the tools we're introducing. And then some of them might finally get to the point where the code is the source of truth, and maybe the tech writers are in there, annotating and making that better. So that can be another part of the workflow, obviously. And like I say, different teams are at different maturity levels in the workflow. All right, so we're at the halfway point. I've got 10 minutes on my timer, but this is what we're using the OpenAPI specification for. I think these are probably the table stakes, the basics. When I first heard the term table stakes, I didn't know that it meant poker. I thought it literally meant like meaty steaks on the table. Side note. Anyway, we're using it to describe these APIs as a contractual agreement. We're making sure that people know how to edit these documents. We're publishing it as documentation and making sure that we have interactive documentation. That's super important to the developer experience, right? Anybody who's a developer in this room knows I want to try it before I buy it, right? And then we're also using it to either generate client code or display some that we've written more enriched examples. And then this probably is obvious to most people at this conference, but make sure you've agreed upon a lifecycle and a workflow for that OAS file because you're making it better every time. So make sure that you're using version control and being very, protective of that file and making it better all the time, improving it. So now we get into the more complex and I'd say higher level work that you're going to do with the OpenAPI standard, right? You're going to start to do linting and you're going to do this sort of static analysis, right? So everybody's probably heard of Spectral. It's been mentioned quite a few times here. And this is an example of using it directly in your IDE, Visual Studio Code. And it can, go line by line and help you find what problems or warnings or errors you have and offer suggestions, and then you can also, on top of the base guidelines, write your own for your, different teams, different guidelines, what matters to your company, to your business. Another facet is using OpenAPI to generate API changelogs. And I was so happy to hear this morning when Microsoft was talking about API stewardship that one of the things that really gets teams to realize, like, okay, I'll slow down and pay attention, is the idea of detecting breaking changes, right? So if you can get teams to start looking at, oh, if I do maintain this API changelog or this API specification and I look for changes over time and I start detecting that someone has introduced something breaking, I can make sure that doesn't get introduced into an actual release. So this has become really important, and I'm going to go back to work and just really start doubling down on this and just help people understand, look, never change, string to number. You're going to break people. They're going to be unhappy with us. It's just not something worth doing unless, I don't know. I can think of very rare cases where breaking is okay, and then you would have an entire, deprecation cycle, and you'd help your users through that, right? But I think that this is really key as you get further along with your workflow. And then another thing that we are working on is using your OpenAPI documents to detect drift. And I think that was another part of the keynote this morning, was that developers are really interested in what's the different changes going on. So at Cisco, we've got this open source project called API Clarity with this, I don't know what the little animal is to tell the truth, but it's able to detect when your OpenAPI file has started drifting based on what's running in your service, right, compared to the OpenAPI spec. Sometimes those are just generic drifts. Something's happening, something's different. You need to look at your service and update the spec. But there's actually more interesting types of drift. So you can also use your specification files to detect shadow APIs. Sounds scary, right? Not that scary, but it is scary as someone with a documentation background. This is terrible. These are undocumented paths. Ah! So what's happening here is this API Clarity is able to see, you know what? There's something where you can go get tags. There's a path. Someone can go get it right now. There's a, I don't know, like a 200 response and everything. but it is not in your API spec at all. And so this is considered to be shadow path. It's there, someone can use it. You've not written it down, so no one knows how to use it or even if it's meant to be there. Maybe this is meant to be a private API. Nobody knows. So it's in the shadows. This can also be detected in undocumented query parameters. So the service is letting people look for these, different catalog items and find out more about them. Is that intentional? Your spec doesn't have it, so it's not in your documentation. Let's figure out why that's sitting in the shadows, right? And then another one that has a really interesting name is the zombie API, right? So this is a deprecated path. Literally, the spec had deprecated true, and it has come back to life somehow. And so it is running in the service, it's still active, and this API clarity tool has been able to detect, look out, this is still there. So this is obviously a problem that InfoSec would want to know about, OPSEC is going to want to get in there, figure out what's going on. Zombie APIs are not what you want. So, and I'm down to the 12th facet. I don't know what happens after the 12th, but anyway, what we're getting into next at Cisco, and this is our big, kind of thrust for the next year is, okay, we want to see how well your teams are doing. And I think this is meant to be, my keyword is always assistive, not punitive. So how is your API doing? How can we help with governance? How can we help with compliance, right? So instead of saying, you are not, you're not being contractual, we're trying to say, well, okay, your API is evolving. How can we help you get an 18-month plan, a 12-month plan to get into a place where you are versioned with an API roadmap that your developers trust and that is highly reliable to them, right? So this is where we're getting into API contract health, API governance, and we have been, I'll admit it, doing all this by Excel spreadsheets by hand, right? This is where we're literally doing API assessments one line at a time. So nobody likes to do anything by hand for very long, especially across our large portfolio, as you can imagine. So enter our new tool that we're working on internally with teams right now called API Insights. And so what people can do, and I tell you, I just went to a talk where Google is doing this as well. It's basically an API registry where people can enter, hey, we have these APIs, can you take a look? And this helps us, right? You want an inventory of your APIs, you want to know what's running, as well as being able to get a score. And so with that score, we can see, oh, how's it doing over time? What are the actual problems that are indicated? And we can work with teams more closely and get better scale out, right? So the life cycle is the part also that, the InfoSec people want to take a look at. This one actually degraded by 10 points. I mean, the points are all made up and it doesn't matter anyway, but the idea is that developers should be able to drill down, and the big win, of course, is that if you have a CLI, you can put this into your CI/CD tooling, right? Any pipeline, GitHub Actions, Travis CI, Jenkins, doesn't matter. You can detect those changes because, as I mentioned, you've brought the teams along to say, I'm going to manage this OAS file in GitHub with a good lifecycle, and now you're going to be able to run this CLI, this tester against it to see how it's changing over time. And one of the examples is, this is kind of small print, but we require representation field names be lower camel case. Very detailed, right? But this can detect it and show the exact line where it is out of compliance. So this is going to help a developer, and what we are also doing is putting it into the IDE, obviously like Spectral is doing, right? So this is just very helpful because it is that whole shift left, get it into the developer's workflow earlier and earlier, and just give them a place where they can detect these early and where we're not just doing this line by line in spreadsheets, right? So we've gone through our 12 facets. And I think the real gem is the OpenAPI tools and communities. And so that's everyone here, and the fact that we can get together in person again is just awesome. I love it. But I do want to point to OpenAPI.tools. This is a great resource. Sorry for the wall of text. Anyway, I'm going to throw Stev under the bus for that. That's a wall of text. That should not be here. But the great thing is it's collected by what you're trying to do. It can also be sorted by where in the life cycle you are. I think that'd be a really good way to start putting these, where in the life cycle do I need security? Well, you kind of need security everywhere. Where in the life cycle do I need testing? You might put that in different places, right? So I really like OpenAPI.tools. And then the communities are a lot of places, right? We're finding community in different foundations, finding community at different blogs that you can read, finding community in the podcasts we're listening to, finding community in conferences like this. And so I just think it's really important that we all kind of stay in touch. I'm meeting people here. It's so great to hear from the Microsoft stories and understand that we've all been living in caves the last 2 years, and now we're all coming out and kind of sharing. It's really great. So viewing all the facets, and I think the important part about a facet is just that, bringing more to light, making sure that as you slice through the different parts of the spec, you can understand, okay, whose view am I looking at this from, right? So if your view is the one consuming the API, then maybe you're going to look for it, okay, what does this API do? Is it really something that's in it for the problems I'm solving right now? And then maybe you need it because you need it to generate code. I've got to make a quick proof of concept. My director's looking for this tomorrow. Please just let me make something simple. I'll clean it up later, right? And then also it can be a really good, format to just, give me a chance to just let me export. I need maybe a different definition somewhere else, right? And then for engineering groups, these are the ones maybe publishing, maybe they're internal, maybe they're external, the OAS is going to let people do a lot of things that just let you have that language across what is your API trying to do. Can I, look at some interactive documentation? And I tell you, working in APIs, I feel like a lot of times the interactive documentation is the best interface to your API. It's kind of the best way to let someone really get their hands on it and look at it and say, does it do this thing, right? Simple. In a web browser, you don't need to bring anything but a computer and an internet connection and give them a key and they're going to go do interesting things, right? So I am loving the idea that you can start to make API change logs and that you can start to detect breaking changes. Our engineers are loving that as well. And then the whole idea of like linting and trying to help people match guidelines is, it's helping with consistency. Consistency helps users. We get beat up if we're not consistent. We all know this, right? And then I think it's super interesting to have this dynamic analysis, right? Your engineering team is running this service. They want to be able to detect, like, wait a minute, this is a zombie API that is not intentional, or this is not documented. Quick, let's get the documentation behind it. Put it in the spec as it was intended. And then, of course, your security folks are going to be happier with this, right? Breaking changes is never good for anybody. And this whole idea that you can look at a scorecard over time and look at changes over time is super important, right? So anyway, I really think this is the way that we can start looking at different angles of the OpenAPI spec. And I just really appreciate everybody coming. Hopefully this is a good introduction to the OpenAPI specification. A look at the different ways we're using it for developer.cisco.com and looking at ways you can use it across, let me tell you, a broad variety of different engineering teams with different use cases, different features, different things they're documenting. And so last of all, I want to make sure that I let you know I am hiring someone who loves to do API governance and would like to work with teams at Cisco. Some of these teams are very new to the whole world of REST APIs. Some of these teams are ready to go and have become really experts at this. And so I just love to have somebody take a look at this job description. If you have input on the job description itself, please let me know. If you're interested in the job, please apply. And I would just love to hear more from you on our ideas around building world-class APIs at Cisco. And I'll take questions. Bring them. Let me know what you got. Thanks. Yeah, question.
I did not know that Cisco was kind of coming up with
Right, so the question is, you didn't know that Cisco was coming up with REST API tools, that's good to know. And then is the tool for internal use or external use? So right now, that API Insights tool is for internal use. We're piloting with teams, but our intention is to open source it. Although looking at what Google's got already, I'm like, man, I don't know. Get a little worried about that. But because in open source, you want to work with others, right? So, but what Cisco is really interested in doing is we can do a lot of observability and we understand telemetry really well. So I think it makes sense for us to start looking at services and what is going on. And so, the whole idea of API Clarity, that is an open source project available today. So you can go to apiclarity.io and take a look. So the thing that's detecting the drift, shadow, zombie, you can go get that and run it on anything running a Kubernetes gateway today. Yeah.
Then it's the developer, then it goes to the documentation of it. The product manager always do that?
Not always. So the question is, I showed this slide with the product managers starting out with the draft and then moving to the engineers. This, I would say, is the exception and not the rule, but we are trying to get teams to do this. So that's why it's here, because we're using it in our training. We're trying to get teams to understand this would be the best way to do it. But and this is me being like honest, there are not a ton of good API product managers in the world. I see nodding heads, that's good to know. And so this is ideal, not every day. Yeah.
I mean, in our company, pretty much the engineering goes right. Everything.
You skipped a step too? Yeah. Yeah. What do y'all think about the whole idea of code as a source of truth? Like, do you end up with enough enrichment there? So it means that all of your annotations in the code would generate your OAS file. But it would mean that you would have to write a lot in your annotations.
I see a problem with that because, I mean, that's exactly the code-first approach that we are trying to avoid, right? The right side is the design-first approach. The left side is the code-first approach that we are trying to avoid.
Yeah.
And I mean, it works well with Java and a couple of things, but people are writing, from Python, Scala, Go, and everything. Not all of them may have annotations.
Yeah.
But the most important thing is it is a code-first approach which is wrong.
Yeah. And listening to Joyce Lynn from Postman, her talk this morning, in her experience, the code-first approach had the worst developer experience. So as a manager in developer experience, I'm like, yeah, we need to probably tell teams not to do this. But your comment? Or you had a question? Yeah.
No, I had a comment on this. So I have worked at places that kind of did it both ways, and that also had a good experience with code first. But at that company, it was like all of our APIs they were reviewed very rigorously, like the code, and then we didn't have to do like this, like comment annotations. It was C#, and we were using a tool called SwaggerGen to automatically generate. And it was also, we didn't do that, but we always did the OpenAPI spec first for public-facing APIs. That was
Gotcha.
very important because it was part of like the, like the contract, like making sure that we were showing our customers that plan was coming first and very intentional. But we did do this code first approach for some of our internal APIs, and then just generated the spec from there.
Good.
And it wasn't ideal because I really would prefer to do it first, like the OpenAPI spec.
Yeah.
That being said, it was pretty convenient, and it only really worked because we were very intentional about making sure all of our APIs followed the same, like rules and whatnot, like during code review. I think that if that hadn't been the case, then it would have been very useful because the spec that we generated would have been all over the place.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think in general, I really believe that it's better to not go code first, but I think like you can make it work in certain contexts.
if you're strict, if you all agree this is important, yeah.
Step, like, for if your company is trying to build an API and you're like, hey, I really want to get this to be a thing, I want to show like
Yeah,
bring it, like,
show the benefit and sneak it in. I like that. Yeah, yeah, that's great. I can't tell who's talking because you have a mask on. Okay, thanks. Only certain people. Yeah, true. Yeah.
And then I have a whole bunch of things I need to express in my OpenAPI that are ancillary.
Yeah.
Like gateway information,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
stuff like that.
So his point is that it's limited because it's only certain people have access, and yeah, yeah. But anyway, thanks so much for coming, y'all. I know you could have gone to Frank's, but thanks for coming to this one, and I love feedback. Thank you so much.